All right, everyone. A very good morning to all of you. We will be again continuing our discussion in this particular tutorial, which is again a continuation of the constitutional design itself. And after having discussed the South African case study, after having discussed their struggle against apartheid, after having discussed the post-independent South Africa and their path to the constitution itself, and after eventually discussing the importance of a constitution, the need for a constitution, let's come back to our own country. Yes, because at the end of the day, we are all Indians, and it is very important for us to understand the Indian context of how the constitution came to exist, what were the challenges to the constitution, to the creation of the constitution, and so on. Yeah, again, it's like a story, so please make sure you have your ears and eyes peeled out and you're listening very well. Yes, and please do make sure you're making your notes as well. All right. Now, just like South Africa, India's constitution was also created under very difficult circumstances, right? So there were a couple of challenges, right, to the creation of the Indian constitution. This is extremely important. These challenges could be asked in your examination as well, and it is very fundamental for us to understand that before the constitution was made, what really was the situation of India and how did it cope up with these challenges in order to create this wonderful document called the Indian Constitution, right? And of course, you have done a lot of this in grade 8, right? So it should not come across as something very very new to you all. कर चुके हो आप लोग ये सब, ठीक है? You guys have done all of this, so it should not come across as some sort of surprise, right? Fair enough. Let's take up these challenges one by one and see what it was, right? All right. So obviously the first challenge was that India was a socially and culturally complex nation, and it still is even today. It was a humongous nation, it still is even today. So I've written its massive geographical size further added to the challenge of creating a constitution. इतनी डाइवर्सिटी है, इतने सारे लोग हैं, इतने सारे रिलीजन हैं, इतने सारे कस्टम्स हैं, इतने सारे ट्रेडिशंस हैं, इतने सारे ओपिनियंस हैं, इतने सारे पर्सपेक्टिव्स हैं. Imagine trying to come up with one document, right? Trying to come up with one document which is accepted by everybody. Punjabis also, Gujaratis also, Malayalis also, Telugu also, Kannada also, Meghalayans also, Mizoram also. So very challenging, right? Very challenging, of course. So this is challenge number one. Challenge number two was that the people themselves had no idea about the existence of a constitution itself. Constitution क्या होता है वही नहीं पता. Because for the past 250 odd years, we were subjects under the British rule, right? They were our masters, so to speak. But now we were emerging from that status of oppressed subjects to the status of independent citizens, and this added to the challenge because we did not know what to expect, we did not know what to do, right? Particularly the majority of the people, illiteracy rate was very high as well, right? So again, this posed a challenge, right, in order to create a comprehensive document which reflects the aspirations of the people. And of course, the third point you're very well aware of, most of you would have witnessed this in your families itself, the traumatic partition that India underwent when it was divided into India and Pakistan on the communal basis, right? That is on the basis of religion. So communal lines is on the basis of religion, Hindu and Muslim mostly, and around 10 lakh people were brutally killed, slaughtered, murdered in riots on both sides of the border, right? And this 10 lakh figure is just a general estimate. It was definitely a lot more than that, right? Who were brutally killed in very violent communal riots on both sides of the border. Now they had to consider this also, that India was emerging out of the ashes of partition, out of the trauma of partition, and how best could a document be created which helped people to come together, right? This was the third challenge, of course. And the fourth challenge was the challenge of the princely states as well. 8th standard mein kiya hai ye. Princely states were the royal kingdoms at the time of independence. There were roughly 560 something princely states, छोटे kingdoms, right? And the British had completely left it to them whether they wanted to merge with India or Pakistan or remain independent. Now this merging of the princely states, credit is given to Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel. Please do read up on him. right? All of this is very important. ठीक है. The merger of these princely states into the Indian subcontinent was of course a very challenging and uncertain task, which in turn made the creation of the constitution a lot more challenging, right? तो princely states का भी challenge था, which is another challenge that you need to be mindful of, right? So all of these challenges, these 3-4 that I have listed, and apart from that a lot more, had to be considered by our founding leaders before they drafted the constitution. Are you able to understand? Like, these are very big issues, right? These are very serious issues that had to be considered before the constitution of India could be drafted, right? So I have discussed the challenges. I hope they're easy to understand, right? Now let us move to the path of the constitution itself. Like, how did we go about creating our constitution? What was the idea behind it, and what was the journey per se? So this journey is also very important, right? So now the thing is that unlike South Africa, wherein the idea of how South Africa should look like came only after independence, because when the whites and the blacks sat together, they made some agreements with each other. Only then was the idea of South Africa created. However, in our case, we had an advantage. हमें इस consensus की ज़रूरत नहीं थी कि एक independent India कैसा दिखना चाहिए, right? We did not require this consensus because we had a very long freedom struggle. Right, we had a very long freedom struggle for us to come to this understanding as to how an independent India should look like once it is free from the clutches of the British Empire. Right, so this consensus had evolved itself during the freedom struggle. Okay? And there is no doubt that there were sharp differences of opinion. Indeed, there were sharp differences of opinion even during the freedom struggle about how India should behave, how India should act, and how India should look like after independence. But some basic ideas, like universal adult franchisee, for instance, like equality for all, for instance, right, justice for all, for instance, right, these basic ideas were already something that everyone was in agreement about. ठीक है, तो ज्यादा लोगों को कंसेंसस पर आने की जरूरत नहीं पड़ी. वी ऑलरेडी हैड अ बेसिक अंडरस्टैंडिंग ऑफ हाउ वी वांटेड इंडिया टू लुक लाइक आफ्टर इंडिपेंडेंस. Am I making sense? Right. So the journey looks something like this, that in 1928, well before independence, Motilal Nehru, who's Jawaharlal Nehru's father, and 8 other senior Congress leaders had drafted a very brief, sort of a rough sketch of the constitution for India. So this is where it actually starts. The journey starts in 1928, wherein a very brief idea of a constitution, a very brief sketch of the constitution was drafted by Motilal Nehru and 8 other Congress leaders. Then in 1931, when the Indian National Congress's session was happening in Karachi is today in Pakistan, there was a discussion between the Congress leaders on how independent India's constitution should look like. What values should it reflect? What beliefs should it reflect? How will the political institutions look like? How would a democracy look like? Should we even be a democracy? All those kinds of discussions. Right? So this happened in the Karachi session of the Congress in 1931. Right? And on the basis of that, there were some basic principles, right? Some basic ideas that I was talking about that the leaders agreed on, like universal adult franchisee, for example, right? One vote, one value, one person, one vote, one value for all adults, right? Irrespective of who they are, right? Then right to freedom and equality, obviously, very, very basic stuff. Right to, protection of the rights of minorities, right? Religious minorities, linguistic minorities, tribals, right? So on and so forth in the Constitution of Independent India. So these were some of the basic agreements that they had reached. क्लियर है ना मेरी बात? ठीक है, इट इज़ वेरी सिंपल, राइट? आई डोंट थिंक इट इज़ वेरी वेरी कॉम्प्लिकेटेड ओनली. इट्स प्रीटी सिंपल. ठीक है. सो नाउ these basic values, as I am mentioning, were accepted by the leaders much before the Constituent Assembly met to draft the Constitution. Constituent Assembly met for the first time in 1946. So you can imagine, yeah, this is happening almost 10-15 years back. ठीक है? Are you able to understand? So these basic values were accepted by all the leaders much before the Constituent Assembly met to draft the actual Constitution of India. Am I being clear? And there were a lot of things that helped us. There is no doubt about it. There were a lot of things that helped us, particularly because of our experience with the colonial rule. So, when India was a British colony, there were certain political systems, there were certain political structures that were put in place by the British government, and it helped us to learn how political institutions could function in an independent India. It gave us inspiration. Like, for example, a very good example is that the British had introduced लेजिस्लेचर, लाइक लेजिस्लेटिव असेंबली, जिसमें लॉज बनते हैं. पार्लियामेंट, आपका सेंट्रल लेजिस्लेटिव असेंबली एंड दी स्टेट लेजिस्लेटिव असेंबली, राइट? सो दे हैड ऑल्सो इंट्रोड्यूस दीज लेजिस्लेचर्स, बट विच वर वेरी वीक. दे वर नॉट एंटायरली डेमोक्रेटिक. एंड फॉर द फर्स्ट टाइम, आई बिलीव आई हैव डन दिस विद यू ऑल, एटलीस्ट विद one class of mine I have done, that elections were held in 1937 for the first time to the provincial legislative assembly, that is the state legislative assembly, and the ministries at the central level, but they were not completely democratic. Am I being clear? ठीक है. तो इसका ये मतलब है कि देखो, लेजिस्लेचर का जो आइडिया है वो हमें अंग्रेजों से मिला है. ठीक है. The British have introduced this idea of a legislature. It is not our invention. We have adopted it, and we have adopted it, and we have sort of molded it to our context, to fit our context, to fit the Indian context, so to speak. Right? So they did introduce legislatures, though even though they were not the best, even though they were not completely democratic, but this gave us some experience. That is important, right? It gave us the experience of the working of legislative institutions in setting up our own systems. कि इंडिपेंडेंस के बाद जब हमने डिसाइड किया कि स्टेट में लेजिस्लेटिव असेंबली होगी, महाराष्ट्र में होगी, बिहार में होगी, आंध्रा में होगी, तेलंगाना में होगी, केरला में होगी, तो ये लेजिस्लेटिव असेंबली का क्या रोल रहेगा, और इंडिपेंडेंस के बाद जब पार्लियामेंट बनेगा तो उस पार्लियामेंट का क्या रोल रहेगा. This is our experience of the colonial rule, our familiarity with it, that helped us design these structures. Am I being clear? Right? So, as I have mentioned over here, thus, the Indian Constitution adopted a lot of these institutional details and procedures. Like, legislative assembly is an institution, parliament is an institution, the office of the president is an institution, office of the prime minister is an institution, police system in India is an institution, bureaucracy is an institution, जो तुम्हारे IAS ऑफिसर ये सब हैं. ठीक है, मेरी बात समझ आ रही है? All of it, majority of it in fact, comes from the colonial rule, and particularly from colonial laws like the Government of India Act 1935. Extremely important. Government of India Act 1935 is often called the backbone of the Indian Constitution, because काफी कुछ provisions जो Government of India Act 1935 में थे, we have adopted into our very own Indian Constitution as well. Am I being clear? ठीक है. The Government of India Act 1935 was a colonial law. It happened before independence in 1935. But a lot of the institutional details and procedures were adopted from the Government of India Act 1935. Right? एक तो this was an inspiration, the colonial rule itself was an inspiration. And then there was another benefit as well. Ki our leaders were not shy to learn from the experience of other nations, but on our own terms, to fit our own context. So if you actually read the Indian Constitution, right? If you actually read the Indian Constitution has borrowed a lot of things from the constitutions of other nations. It has borrowed, say for example, it has borrowed the ideas of liberty, equality and fraternity from France. ठीक है? It has borrowed, say for example, directive principles of state policy, which is slightly advanced political science. It has borrowed it from Ireland. ठीक है? Then for instance, the preamble it has borrowed from the Constitution of the United States. Fundamental rights, which is called the Bill of Rights, it is again from the United States. The President as the Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces, again from the United States. ठीक है? Parliamentary form of democracy, we have borrowed from Britain. The idea of a single citizenship, Indians cannot hold multiple citizenships, again we have borrowed from Britain. Distribution of power between central government and state government, जिसको हम फेडरलिज्म बोलते हैं, that we have borrowed from Canada. समझ आ रही मेरी बात? ठीक है? तो there are a lot of things that we have borrowed, but we have modified it based on my explanation. You can see there are a lot of things that have been borrowed, but we have learnt from the experience of other nations. We have seen what has worked for them. We have seen what has not worked for them, and we have borrowed them on our own terms. We have modified it to our context. ठीक है? तो मैंने एग्जाम्पल भी दिया है that many leaders were inspired by the ideas of the French Revolution, liberté, égalité, fraternité, right? Parliamentary democracy in Britain जो हमने अडॉप्ट किया है, Bill of Rights, that is fundamental rights in the US, वो भी हमने अडॉप्ट किया है. ठीक है? So we have adopted all of this, and we are not ashamed to say that we have adopted. It has worked well for us. There's no shame, right? It has worked well for us. And of course, the Russian Revolution also inspired our leaders to create a socialist system, right? Socialist system which is based on social and economic equality between all citizens in the society. मेरी बात समझ आ रही है? ठीक है? मेरी बात समझ आ रही है? ठीक है? तो all of these factors, as you can see, have contributed to the making of the constitution itself. ठीक है? So all of these factors have contributed to the making of the constitution, right? So this is a journey, as you can understand, right? This is a journey, as you can understand, wherein I have discussed what was the path taken by the leaders in order to frame the constitution. Where did the journey start from? It started from 1928. Then there was the Karachi Resolution of 1931. Then there was the Constituent Assembly eventually that came forward to discuss how did they get inspired, how did the British influence come into our constitution, how did we get inspired from other nations as well, and what were some of the challenges also that we had faced before we went ahead and drafted the constitution. That is what forms the context of the Indian constitution itself. I hope this was quite explanatory, and if there are any queries, please do reach out, and thank you.